And thanks for staying with us on Morning Live. And we continue, reflecting on that gazetted situation with regard to Eskom. And so much been said already this morning. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has come under fire for exempting Eskom from some regulations that require state-owned entities to disclose expenditure that does not comply with the provisions of the Public Finance Management Act. And I suppose that's ultimately what it comes down to. Now, the notice in the government gazette says that Eskom will be exempt from disclosing irregular expenditure that is not linked to criminal activity for 3 years, starting from the financial year that ends March 2023. Now, while organizations like the Black Business Council and OUTA have questioned the rationale behind this decision, Treasury says that it does meet accounting standards. So for some analysis on this matter, we're joined by Independent Analyst and Academic Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good to have you with us. So just firstly, the explanation, or should we say the lack thereof, in the actual gazette and what we've heard subsequently. Does this all, make sense? Is this something that South Africans should not be too alarmed about? Because it seems as though everybody is losing their minds. Are we justified in doing so?
Good morning to the viewers. So the very first problem is that the gazette in its current form is quite simply nonsensical. The gazette says nothing about the reasons behind the exemption. The gazette makes no distinction between what you may call criminal conduct versus non-compliance with rules and regulations that are written by the PFMA. So when the gazette made its way to the public in its abrupt form, it was inevitable that people would indeed become hysterical, because it quite simply indicated that Eskom was being exempted from applying the rules that apply to everyone else. So that's the first problem. The details that we now know are details that have come afterwards, when questions were being asked about what exactly is the intention and what is this gazette all about. So it's only then that National Treasury and Eskom thought it was important for the public to actually understand what on earth had happened behind the scenes before the notice was issued. So the first problem comes from whoever released that gazette, whoever drafted it, has done such a remarkably poor job. It has created this crisis where we now know that things are much more complicated than what the gazette implied.
But this is Eskom that we are talking about, Khaya. And, with everything that has gone on at Eskom, the corruption, the malfeasance, the maladministration, you name it, this Eskom, given that they have really brought this country to its knees in more ways than one, does this actually make sense to exempt Eskom from reporting on certain provisions? Because thinking about it, is this an official and legitimate sanction to basically shield Eskom from some of the other negative consequences on the open market? Or is this really just another way of, not dealing with the actual issues that the power utility faces?
So there are a couple of issues I need to canvass here. The first question is whether this is a blanket exemption. Well, it actually isn't. What this exemption says is that instead of putting the details around irregular expenditure on the face of the income statement or on the face of the notes to the financial statements, where they have to be comprehensively audited by the Auditor General, we are simply shifting those disclosures to the annual report, where the need for the Auditor General to audit it with as much detail as she does the financial statements is simply not the same. So if Eskom goes and steals 10 Rand tomorrow, that 10 Rand will be reported. It's now a question of where it is reported rather than it not being reported. So that shift from the financial statements with the Auditor General has to audit and express an opinion on to the annual report simply means that there's going to be a much bigger burden on you and I as a reader to actually find out what has happened at Eskom. So the example that we can use is what Transnet has done with this particular exemption. So instead of having to declare it upfront that this is an irregular expenditure that has been incurred, and these are the reasons behind it, it has simply then put it in its annual report. So the exemption does not actually create an information blackout. It simply creates an information digging process where you have to look much deeper in order to find out what this information is. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that this gazette, well, the implication of the gazette rather, is that it now makes a distinction between the types of irregularities that get disclosed. So if something is relating to criminal conduct, the Auditor General is still duty bound to report and talk about it. So if Eskom went and stole money tomorrow and there was criminal conduct, the exemption does not get them away from disclosing that. They still have to talk about it. So that particular distinction simply says that, look, if the reason Eskom has been found to be wanting by the Auditor General is that Eskom did not look for 3 codes when the law said it must look for 3 codes, that is fundamentally different to Eskom actively stealing money. So the idea here is that once that distinction is created, what the Auditor General will now express an opinion on is the financial statements in their current form, which are still compliant with international financial reporting standards. She will also express an opinion on blatant acts of criminality as they emerge. However, the opinions relating to non-compliance with the PFMA in particular will only be in the annual report. And the consequence of that is that if the Auditor General is going to issue a qualified audit opinion, the basis for the qualification will not be the fact that Eskom did not get 3 codes when they should have got it, because that is non-compliance with the PFMA. So that distinction here is that Eskom is now saying that we should actually have an audit opinion that reflects the actions that we do rather than the non-compliance with the PFMA, which they regard as ancillary rather than fundamental to their operations.
But this is corruption-riddled Eskom that we are talking about. And one would imagine that you would want tighter controls and not opportunity to perhaps be more lax in certain instances.
Yeah, so that is a problem, in that unfortunately it is the wrong entity that has asked for this particular exemption, because the fact that they've got so much issues of historical corruption, and also from what we heard from their outgoing CEO, some of these issues are still ongoing. It does create anxieties about whether they will then use this exemption as a loophole to essentially hide much more of the ongoing corruption. So the problem here is that we do not know what they will do with this particular gazette, with this particular exemption. We know what Treasury's intention is, but whether that materializes at the grassroots level at Eskom is something that we'll not know until we actually start assessing it. So you can imagine if somebody was already planning on committing acts of corruption and they now know that this particular loophole exists, they may simply coach or rather cover their acts of malfeasance in a manner that enables it to benefit from this new loophole that has been created. So it definitely creates problems on the questions of accountability. But also the one point that National Treasury keeps emphasizing is that the consequences of this persistent qualified audit opinions is that Eskom's conversations with the lenders and the credit rating agencies are always made much more difficult by these qualifications that are based on historical rather than current issues. So in their view, once Eskom is only accountable for the things that are happening now, it will make it easier for them to say, look, if there's an ongoing issue, it's because we have done something, rather than 10, 15 years ago, somebody did something and we cannot find out why they did it and we cannot hold them accountable, which is currently the case now.
So one question about that is, how is that likely to help them, given that their financial woes, the fraud, corruption, and everything at Eskom is so well documented in the media, for example? How is this going to help them?
Well, the main problem is that, in my view, any credit rating agency and any lender will probably still dig deep enough to go to the back of the financial statements and find these particular details. So whether they will then say, okay, now that we can see the distinction between historical irregular expenditure and new irregular expenditure, for example, it changes our decision making, that's a bit more difficult to call. But the issue here is that a lot of people have made the assumption that if it's in the back of the financial statements, then suddenly nobody is going to factor it in that decision making.
Wow.
But it will be simply reckless for any lender or for any credit rating agency to ignore that information. What they will simply engage Eskom on is on the distinction between issues that are historical in nature, that Eskom says, look, we quite simply cannot explain things that happened before we were here because we also are still trying to connect the dots, versus issues that emerge under their custodianship and under their management, which they must be held fully accountable for.
But see, that logic is a bit short-sighted because, and I put this to Mr. Momoniat as well, that situation is not peculiar to Eskom. I'm sure the boards of many other state-owned entities would like to make the same argument that they don't want to account for historical stuff that they were not a part of. So, you know, where does this lead us to going forward? Because what, and I asked Mr. Momoniat this, Khaya, what would then stop other entities from asking for the same exemption, and on what basis can Treasury rightfully bat them away?
Yeah, now it's obviously created this arbitrary distinction between institutions that knew that you could apply for such an exemption and institutions that didn't. Because up until now, only Transnet had pursued this avenue, and Eskom then found out about it and then also pursued it. The key problem here is that if National Treasury is of the view that we should indeed be drawing a distinction between historical irregularities and new irregularities. What is very simple, they must go to section 55 of the PFMA and make that distinction very clear, so that when the Auditor General looks at this information, she's able to say that, look, in relation to new irregularities, this is the opinion that I'm expressing. In relation to historical irregularities, they are to be found somewhere else in the annual report. So for those of you that want to know about them, that's where you must go and read. And that would be a matter of a principled decision that says, if South Africa's state-owned enterprises at large have been afflicted by the same issues that we found at Eskom and the same issues that we found at Transnet, then let's have a uniform approach into how we're dealing with it. What is happening now is that, unfortunately, we're now seeing governance by exception, where those entities that have been able to convince National Treasury that their cases or their case studies are unique have been able to get the exemption. It'll be difficult to imagine that the road accident fund, for example, which has even more bigger problems than Transnet and Eskom, it's difficult to imagine how they would not be granted the same exemption. And then as soon as the road accident fund gets the exemption, Alexco will be at the door, Denel will be at the door, SAA will be at the door. So it's quite difficult to reconcile the logic that National Treasury applies when, if it's very clear that there is an issue relating to the distinction between historical malfeasances and current practices, will then amend the regulation so that the Auditor General can do her job in relation to the law as it exists, rather than firstly having to ask every single company, do you have an exemption? Has the exemption been granted? So therefore, these are the audit procedures going to look like. It is going to create a lot of chaos.
Well, thanks so much, Khaya. We're going to leave it there. Independent Analyst and Academic Khaya Sithole discussing government's latest decision to exempt Eskom, and not a blanket exemption, but to be exempt from certain provisions of the Public Finance Management Act. So that's also our question of the day. Let us know what your thoughts are at Morning Live SABC.